Welcome to the Jewish Christian Studies podcast. This program is sponsored by King's Evangelical Divinity School. And now, here's your host, Ruben Gomez.
Today, I'm very pleased to have a special guest with us. And we are going to have a very interesting conversation. All the way from California, the United States of America, I've got with me Dr. Jen Rosner, who's an affiliate assistant professor of systematic theology at Fuller Theological Seminary. Welcome, Jen. Nice to have you with us.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
It's an honor to have you. Now, the reason Dr. Rosner is with us, she is a scholar in Messianic Judaism, among other things. She's been studying it and living it for quite some time. And also because she is part of what we're going to talk about today, Messianic Judaism. Now, what on earth is Messianic Judaism? We've heard about Judaism many times. We know about Christianity. But what kind of Judaism is Messianic Judaism? Now, could you start us off by explaining to our audience what it means when we talk about Messianic Judaism?
Yes, sure. It's a great question. I think maybe we'll start with sort of a general definition and description, and then we need to give a little bit of history and context for why it's significant in our day. So Messianic Judaism is a pretty wide movement. There's lots of different iterations of Messianic Judaism, which we can talk about. I would say at the baseline, it is Jews who follow Jesus as the Messiah, who seek to continue living as Jews rather than giving up Jewish identity and becoming Christians in the sense that anyone else might be a Christian. And so that's what I would say is a baseline definition. Jews who consider that Jewish identity, Jewish tradition, Jewish practice are still significant in some way, and who seek to live that out in the context of following Jesus. If we were to look at that historically, that's been a really hard thing to do for the last 1700 years. If we read our New Testaments, that's exactly what we have. We have Jesus as Israel's long foretold Messiah. We have all of his disciples and apostles and the authors of the New Testament living and writing in this context where they are all following Jesus, mostly as Jews. We don't really get Gentile inclusion until the book of Acts. So if we're reading the Gospels, we're talking about Jesus, the Jewish Messiah, with his Jewish followers, all living within the context of Second Temple Judaism. Very quickly after that, you begin to get a strong and sustained strain of Christian anti-Judaism, whereby the early church fathers, even beginning in the 2nd century, and then later with figures like John Chrysostom, Justin Martyr, who begin to, and again, we could sort of unpack what's going on historically and contextually that's contributing to this trend. But you begin to get Judaism and Christianity defining themselves over against one another. This process is sometimes referred to as the parting of the ways between
Right.
Judaism and Christianity. I would say that's sort of slowly gaining traction over the first few centuries after, Jesus. The Council of Nicaea in 325 is a moment where certain trends are institutionalized with Constantine, who was the emperor at the time, the Nicene Creed, which is sort of a result ultimately of the Council of Nicaea. The way that Christian theology is being thought about is sort of not Judaism. And similarly, we get a trend within Rabbinic Judaism, which is what sort of happens to Judaism after the Second Temple is destroyed. Judaism has to figure out how to sort of reinvent itself without a temple, and you get what ends up being called Rabbinic Judaism. And Rabbinic Judaism is sort of defining itself over against Christianity. So you get these two religious traditions that are not the other, and their existence is everything that the other one isn't. And within that framework that endures for centuries, really up until like 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th centuries, it's basically impossible to follow Jesus as a Jew. You're sort of one or the other. You're a Jew or a Christian. In fact, we have conversion liturgies from the 7th century where if a Jew wanted to become a Christian, which once you get Christian majority societies was oftentimes socially advantageous to be a Christian, they had to renounce any any contact with Jewish community, Jewish practices, Jewish identity, and in many cases eat pork, which is not kosher, as evidence that they were leaving Judaism behind and then entering Christianity. So once you get this kind of parting of the ways, there really isn't an option for Jews to follow Jesus as Jews. You are either a Jew who does not follow Jesus, or you're a Christian who follows Jesus and has nothing to do with Judaism. You have this mutually exclusive construct for a very long time with identity, but are still largely embedded in the Christian world. We begin to see some shifts again as we get into the modern era. Then you begin to have a movement called Hebrew Christianity, which is Jews who hold on to some significance of their Jewish. It's really not until the latter half of the 20th century that you get the emergence of the modern Messianic Jewish movement, which is what we're seeing now, which is Jews who are claiming Judaism as a religion, claiming Jewish identity as a central marker of who we are, and then seeking to live all of that out in the context of following and believing in Jesus. Of course, there's a connection to what we see in the first century, what we read about in our New Testaments, but then there's a whole lot of complex history between now and then that has to be wrestled with in terms of how do we actually do this in a contemporary context.
Right. Because many people believe that the only way to be a Jew today is to be a Christian, right?
Right.
What I'm going to say may sound like a bold statement in the ears of many Christians who don't know much about this, but couldn't we say that there is no church without the Jews and Judaism?
I would say that historically, we have to understand something about God's covenant with the people of Israel in order to understand the context of the church, which I very much understand as Gentiles in a Romans 11 kind of sense, Gentiles being grafted in to God's existing, ongoing, enduring covenant with the people of Israel. We could also take your question in another sense. The church was always intended to be a body of Jews and Gentiles coming together, worshiping the God of Israel side by side. And all of that has gotten blurred and obscured once we get this enduring thread of Christian anti-Judaism and later Christian anti-Semitism, whereby God's covenant with Israel is no longer a significant category in terms of thinking about Christian theology, thinking about Christian identity, thinking about Christian discipleship. It just sort of passes away. And I think we're in this era where a lot of these categories, in ways that I find very hopeful, are being rethought.
Now, our listeners will probably be aware of the concept of supersessionism. To put it in simple terms, the replacement of the old covenant people, Israel, by the new people of God, that is the church.
Real.
But historically, that has been a zero-sum game. Why do we have to think that for Jews to win, Christians must lose, and vice versa?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it comes out of this parting of the ways, the aftermath of the parting of the ways, this construct whereby it's one or the other, arguing over who has the genuine, authentic, enduring covenant with God. And I don't think it was intended to be that way. And I don't even think the figures that we read about in our New Testament necessarily saw that coming. I do think in the New Testament, we are seeing tension between Jesus and his followers and the Jewish leadership structure of his day. But I think that's well within the context of Second Temple Judaism, who are all posturing about who has it right and who's applying Torah correctly. And I think once we get this later development whereby the Gentile church becomes so large, Paul, as the apostle to the Gentiles, is very successful, as are his successors, in sort of the Christian church growing among the Gentiles. Meanwhile, you have this very small section of Jewish followers of Jesus that's increasingly getting stamped out as you have these mutually exclusive identity constructions of Judaism and Christianity. And I think that is the moment where you get this zero-sum construct. Christians are saying that the Jewish temple was destroyed because God's done with the Jewish people. Jews are saying that Christians have compromised the oneness of God. So you get these doctrinal, ideological spats that have been enduring ever since. I think all of this comes out of this very complex first, second, third, fourth century setting where we see Christian doctrine. Through Constantine, we get Christian coupled with empire for the first time. So now you have Christianity in power. There's this sort of imperial drive for Christianity to be the main religion of the empire. You have Jews who at different points are revolting against the Roman Empire and causing chaos. And so you have all kinds of political structures and complexities at play that end up, as you said, with this zero-sum game that I think we've been living in the legacy of for a very long time.
So coming back to our situation right now, not long ago, during the 19th century, there was, as you said, Hebrew Christianity, so-called. But in the 20th century, after the Jesus movement and Jews for Jesus and so on, we begin to see and hear about Messianic Judaism. Now, we've changed not only the name, but it seems to me that we've changed the point of reference as well, because we are not talking about something belonging to Christianity, but a body that has as its point of reference Judaism. Can you explain a little bit about how this change in name has further implications in the way we are to understand Messianic Judaism?
There's a slightly longer history that goes back before the 20th century with different organizations that fall under the category of what we would call Hebrew Christianity. They're still Christians, but there's some sense of Jewish identity that is significant. The pretty significant shift has taken place later, maybe even with the work of Mark Kinzer at the beginning of the 21st century. His first book was published in 2005 called Post-Missionary Messianic Judaism. Mark Kinzer is one of the key thinkers who has been trying to move Messianic Judaism away from the evangelical Christian context in which it emerged. This is, again, I mean, we have these 18th, 19th, early 20th century figurations of this in what's called Hebrew Christianity. You also have in the latter half of the 20th century, the reemergence of the modern Messianic Jewish movement, but it's all within the context of evangelical Christianity. It's a little bit like Hebrew Christianity 2.0. And Mark Kinzer is one of the people saying, we need to take Messianic Judaism seriously as a Judaism, and we need to be sort of thinking in Jewish categories and asking questions that are more Jewish oriented rather than Messianic Judaism being kind of a subset of evangelical Christianity. Mark Kinzer is probably the leading thinker in this vein, making a case for what Messianic Judaism ought to be. If you look at the situation on the ground, the majority of the Messianic Jewish movement still feels a lot more like evangelical Christianity with some sort of Jewish trappings than actually what Mark Kinzer's talking about. So he's casting a vision for something. He is doing a lot of work in different areas to try to make that a reality. I think it's more a reality today than it's ever been. But if you think that's representative of the wider Messianic Jewish movement, I don't think it is. If you walk into any Messianic Jewish congregation anywhere in the world, it's more likely to feel like a church than a synagogue. This transition that Mark Kinzer is trying to perpetuate is very slow in gaining traction on the ground.
Yes, what he called in 2000, I think he wrote a booklet about the nature of Messianic Judaism, and he wanted to explain a concept that later became known as bilateral ecclesiology, right? But he called originally, I think, Binitarian. Now, could we say that there are two different souls within Messianic Judaism?
In terms of one that's more Christian, one that's more Jewish?
Of the community of faith, which becomes the reference point.
I think that it's fair to call it all one movement because what it really is at its heart, and again, if we really sort of get into the nitty-gritty, it's not even exactly what I'm describing it as, which is Jews who are trying to follow Jesus as Jews, because you also have lots of non-Jews who are drawn for a variety of reasons to the Messianic Jewish movement. If you were to walk into a Messianic Jewish congregation anywhere in the world, it is very likely that there would be a majority of non-Jews in that congregation because you have lots of non-Jews who are interested in Messianic Judaism. I think that's a big question for the future of Messianic Judaism. How are we thinking about not just Jews and non-Jews, Jews and Gentiles within the body of Messiah, which is a question that I wrestle with a lot, but how are we thinking about Jews and non-Jews within Messianic Judaism? I think that's a question in and of itself. So that's one dynamic. But I do think that even if we're to sort of say that there's this overarching umbrella category of Jews trying to follow Jesus as Jews, there's going to be lots of different answers about how those who identify as Messianic Jews relate to something like rabbinic traditions. How much Judaism do we think still matters and still applies? How much is sort of done away with? And there's a lot of different estimations within Messianic Judaism and a lot of very healthy discussion and dialogue about our identity as Jews and followers of Jesus. So I think, there might be more than two souls within that, right? But I think it's fair to say you have a strong contingent that feels more like some kind of iteration of Christianity, and an emerging contingent that feels more like some kind of iteration of Judaism.
And also, there seems to be two different poles as well. One, Israel itself, the state of Israel, and Messianic Jews there,
Yeah.
which is one reality, right? But then a larger body of Messianic Judaism outside of Israel in the diaspora. So does that affect also the way Messianic Judaism is practiced?
Yes, absolutely. And I would say in somewhat counterintuitive ways, Messianic Judaism in Israel tends to look a lot more like Christianity. In Israel, it's accepted that everybody's Jewish. Messianic Jews, by and large, live alongside and sometimes within the wider Jewish community or the wider Orthodox Jewish community. In many cases, you have Messianic Judaism in Israel trying to distinguish itself from Orthodox Judaism, for example, trying to distinguish itself from the sort of wider Jewish prevailing culture. Whereas in the diaspora, you have Messianic Judaism sort of trying to not prove that we're Jewish, but we live in majority Gentile societies. We live in majority Christian societies, and so the thing that we're really trying to emphasize is our Jewish identity. Whereas in Israel, that's taken for granted. Everybody's Jewish. Not everybody, but you know what I'm saying. And so I actually think it's interesting that in Israel, again, perhaps counterintuitively, Messianic Judaism, I would say, is a little bit less attached to some of the key facets of Jewish practice and life because it's just taken for granted. They're trying to distinguish themselves from Orthodox Judaism, whereas in the United States and other diaspora locations, Messianic Judaism is more trying to distinguish itself from evangelical Christianity.
This might have to do also with the danger of assimilation.
Absolutely.
There is a famous line in Star Trek, so many episodes and different movies, but a very famous line that says, "You will be assimilated. Resistance is futile."
Yep. Right.
Now, I'm quite sure that Jews have felt that very much in the diaspora, right?
Really? Yes, absolutely. And I think that's part of the drive of Messianic Judaism to sort of not succumb to that pull of assimilation. And I think Judaism in general is feeling that pressure in the diaspora, and Messianic Judaism very much relates to whereas in Israel, it's very different. Assimilation in an Israeli context doesn't make sense,
Right,
and so
right.
it's almost that there's this pull to distinguish the Messianic Jewish from the wider Jewish landscape in Israel, where that's just a different set of factors at work in the diaspora. And I think it has very much to do with the issue of assimilation.
Which brings me to a question I wanted to make about when you say Jews following Yeshua, following Jesus, but wanting to live as Jews, right? Now, when you say that, how does that translate in practice? Are you talking about Torah observance? Are we talking about certain forms of liturgy? Could you unpack that for us?
Once you have the emergence of the modern Messianic Jewish movement, very quickly you get the modern Messianic Jewish congregational movement. Messianic Jews begin to plant and nurture and live within the ecclesial space of a Messianic Jewish congregation. There's a great spectrum. Plenty of Messianic Jewish congregations meet on Sundays and feel a lot like a church, mostly an evangelical church. And then maybe there's a couple of Hebrew blessings kind of interspersed, And then you have another, like sort of at the other end of the spectrum would be Messianic Jewish congregations that meet on Saturday, when the rest of the Jewish world is celebrating the Sabbath,
Mhm.
and that have very traditional Jewish liturgy, a Torah scroll, a more traditional expression of Jewish worship. A lot of the service might be in Hebrew. And so you have quite a spectrum. And as we see, it's sort of trying to navigate the complexities that history has bequeathed to us. This whole divide between Saturday and Sunday worship, that comes, post Constantine, especially. There's roots of that in the New Testament. Already you have the mention of the apostles worshiping on the first day, which would be Sunday. But that becomes politicized and institutionalized in a way that continues to drive a wedge between Judaism and Christianity. Messianic Judaism has to decide where it's going to fall on that spectrum. And what you get is it falling all along the spectrum. Messianic Jewish congregations meeting on Sunday, feeling more like a church. Messianic Jewish congregations meeting on Shabbat, on Saturdays, praying the traditional Hebrew Jewish liturgy, reading from a Torah scroll. You also would have a spectrum in terms of how contemporary Messianic Judaism approaches things like Torah observance. You could overlay that onto the spectrum we were just talking about. The congregations that meet on Shabbat and are praying traditional Jewish liturgy in Hebrew, reading from a Torah scroll, are those that are probably more geared towards traditional Torah observance, Shabbat, Jewish holidays, life cycle events, these staples of Jewish identity. Whereas on the more, maybe we would say Christian end of the Messianic Jewish movement, there's sort of less regard for traditional Torah observance. And in some ways, maybe even a distaste for traditional Torah observance. So there's different ways that those issues get related to within the Messianic Jewish community, but you certainly have. And I would say this is where thinkers like myself, Mark Kinzer, are more trying to build into this Jewish end of the spectrum that seeks to live according to the way that Jews have traditionally lived with regard to Torah, life cycle events, how we teach our children, and Hebrew literacy.
So, on a personal level, how do you envisage the role that Messianic Judaism is called to play within such large faith groups on either side, Christianity, Judaism? Is Messianic Judaism a sort of a bridge? If so, in what sense? How do
Yeah.
you view that?
Yeah, it's a great question. The way that I would approach that question, I think it's a fallacy to think that we can just sort of simply go back to a first century reality and live out what they were living in the book of
Yes.
Acts.
Yes.
But I think that if we look at how Jewish followers of Jesus functioned in the New Testament, they were kind of a bridge community. And I think that was the intention. I think you see if something like Romans 11, Gentile inclusion, Gentiles being grafted into God's covenant with the people of Israel. Again, the Jewish followers of Jesus, the apostles, those from Israel now beginning to preach the gospel, see that Israel is being a light to the nations in the way that it was always intended to be. That bridge is what becomes kind of the excluded middle as we increasingly get the parting of the ways. And so I do think that Messianic Judaism, at least sort of theoretically and theologically, if not yet entirely practically, has a role to play in this religious landscape. First of all, in challenging the categories that have come to be accepted in this post-parting of the ways reality, where you have Christianity and you have Judaism, and many would say they don't have, like, we would sort of beg to differ, and we would say you actually sort of need one to understand the other, And so I think we could break that down and say, how does that play out to each community? I mean, I think to the Christian community, I would hope that Messianic Judaism is kind of a reminder about all of the things that have gotten lost along the way within Christian theology and practice. That Christianity is really this outgrowth of Gentile inclusion in God's covenant with the people of Israel. And again, all of these things have been long forgotten in most of Christian theology. And so just a reminder that this whole story began with God's covenant with the people of Israel. That covenant didn't come to an end with Jesus. It came to, in some sense, its next chapter in Jesus, where the nations are then grafted into that. One of the things that I often am doing in spaces where I'm teaching Christians is trying to get us to rethink the narrative, rethink the gospel in ways that have been lost because of the parting of the ways, the legacy of Christian anti-Judaism, the way in which each tradition defines itself over against one another. I think the Christian world, in some sense, doesn't know the fullness of its own identity or story to the extent that it's
Mhm.
completely disconnected from any kind of understanding or engagement with the Jewish people and God's covenant with the people of Israel. If we're going to talk about the Jewish world has very long assumed, and for very good reason, that Jesus is like this Gentile phenomenon, right? Christianity, that's a Gentile thing that doesn't really have anything to do with Jewish people. And if it has, it's been persecution more often than not over the centuries, Christian persecution of the Jewish people. I think to the Jewish world, it's also this kind of reminder that the Jesus who has so often been preached to the Jewish people has been a Jesus that would call them to forsake their Judaism, right? Remember, we mentioned earlier this sort of 7th century conversion liturgy that we could read, where a Jew who wanted to follow Jesus had to renounce all of Judaism. So Jesus has more often than not been a threat to Judaism, been a threat to Jewish identity. And I would hope that Messianic Judaism can begin to at least raise questions about the way in which that entire framework is like an aberration of what it was supposed to
Mm.
be, where you have Jews following Messiah. In that way, I think the Messianic Jewish movement has at least the potential to provide a very helpful challenge and perhaps even corrective to each of these traditions that has increasingly defined themselves in contradistinction from one another. Again, the reality on the ground is often quite different, which is that the Messianic Jewish community is very often not accepted by either side. So it's
Right.
still kind of
That was going to be my next question.
right, right.
Because to the Jews, traditional Jews, believing in Jesus of Nazareth as the Messiah is a no-no, a big no-no. To the Christians, Torah observance might
Right.
also be a big no-no, as
That's,
well as the concept of election.
that's right.
I mean, how do you navigate those two?
Yeah, it's very challenging. Historically, it's been exactly as you said. Like Messianic Judaism has not really been embraced by other side. It's viewed as kind of this syncretistic worst of both worlds sort of thing. But I do think we're starting to see some hopeful shifts in that regard. I see the most hopeful shift coming about in the academic world, Messianic Jewish scholarship. And there's not a ton of Messianic Jewish scholars, but there are some people like Mark Kinzer, who's a great mentor and friend and now colleague of mine, trying to speak into the academy. And it's interesting, you have all of these other scholarly trends going on now as well. For example, the whole way that the New Testament is being understood is shifting. So, for example, Paul was for very long understood through this kind of traditional Lutheran lens. Paul left Judaism behind and
That's
converted,
right.
was the one who was touting like works versus grace in Christ. Judaism's all about we. So you have this kind of Luther who's reading his own struggle with the Catholic Church back into Paul. That's how everybody understood Paul for so long. Now you have, first you have the new perspective on Paul, which is sort of changing the categories. Now you have what's called the Paul within Judaism school, which is
That's
saying that
right.
Paul never left behind Judaism. Perspective goes in line with some of these new trends in New Testament scholarship. And so there's people who are picking up on that, right? If Paul remained a Torah observant Jew. I've heard, for example, Mark Nanos, a Jewish New Testament scholar, thinks the modern Messianic Jewish movement is the closest he can get as a scholar to what it might have looked like to understand these realities in the first century. There's lots of differences between our context in the first century. And I think this is what's so fascinating. And it makes me convinced that God is doing something in our day with regard to these issues, because you have all of these societal trends that we haven't really even talked about. Why does Messianic Judaism emerge in the latter half of the 20th century? There's lots of reasons that you have going on, historical events that are taking place, shifts in all kinds of ways that precipitate the emergence of the Messianic Jewish movement alongside things, new perspectives on the New Testament. I do think I'm seeing ways in which Messianic Jews are increasingly being invited into these conversations in the academic world, even if that's not yet translating into the kind of vision we were talking
Right.
about
Well,
earlier.
because how do we get those ideas and conversations to trickle down to the
Right.
level of Christian and Jewish congregations?
That's right.
It would be a feat, right?
That's right. I think that's for me the key question. How do we take what's going on in these academic conversations? And where I see great strides being made, how do we get that to trickle down? It's something that keeps me up at night. For example, just on a very small scale, my book, Finding Messiah, which came out in 2022, was written not for an academic audience, but to just a wider Christian audience. Like it's my little effort at translating some of these conversations into a context that is accessible to those who are not connected to the academic world. I think you see other academics also trying to write things that are more popular that aren't just going to be read by academics, but it's a long process. And I think it's going to take generations for the landscape on the ground to really begin to shift. The Messianic Jewish world is a very complex space with a lot of tensions, and it's very misunderstood. Part of that is because the Messianic Jewish movement is trying to figure out how to do something that hasn't been done for centuries. It can be off-putting because it's a little bit messy. I think that's also something that is going to take perhaps generations to figure out exactly where it fits and how to live that out.
We could go on forever with this, but there is one other thing just to talk about:
What's interesting is that a Messianic Jewish
the presence of so-called Messianic Gentiles within Messianic Judaism. We have, on the one hand, Messianic Judaism, but also a growing fascination among many non-Jews that leads them to attach themselves to Messianic Jewish congregations, but mostly what's called Hebrew roots movement. Isn't that disconcerting? Isn't that counterintuitive? Shouldn't Messianic Judaism, as I think Kinzer says, be by Jews, for Jews, mainly? I mean, I'm not saying, that precludes the presence of any non-Jewish element within a congregation, but I mean, shouldn't that be the case? And if that's true, how how do you think about this whole situation of a growing Hebrew roots movement? Many people are confused. They don't know much about Messianic Jews. And then they see so many people sort of playing Jew, Isn't that religious appropriation of sorts? I think it's important that we at least address this whole question of Gentile believers attaching themselves to Jewish congregations, or more often than not, their own congregations.
Yeah, I think it's a very important thing to talk about. And I think it is a very widespread phenomenon that, again, we would need an hour. I think one of the things you mentioned earlier, this sort of technical concept that Mark Kinzer espouses called bilateral ecclesiology, where Mark Kinzer, again, leading Messianic Jewish theologian, wants to say that basically the ecclesia, the body of Messiah, has these two wings within it. He makes a very compelling argument that we see a precedent of this in the New Testament, that you have Jews who continue to live as Jews and followers of Messiah. They're not leaving behind Torah. And then you have Gentiles who, this is the whole story of the book of Acts, are
Acts
invited.
15 and 21.
Acts 15 and 21, exactly. So you have Gentiles who are invited into God's covenant, grafted in, but not required or called to live as Jews. And that's this big controversy, right? Acts 15 talks about Jesus believing Pharisees, which sort of like, should burst our categories of like the Pharisees is always the bad guys, which is how they often get portrayed in Christian theology. They're saying if these Gentiles want to be followers of our Messiah, they have to take on Judaism. There's this whole discussion in Acts 15. The conclusion is that the Spirit came upon Gentiles as Gentiles in Acts 10, just as the Spirit came upon Jews as Jews in Acts 2. And so the Spirit has not made a distinction between Jews and Gentiles as having access to God as they are. 1 Corinthians 7 is another key passage where Paul says, this is my rule in all the churches. stay in the position you were called. If you were circumcised,
Yeah.
don't seek to undo that. If you were uncircumcised, that's a euphemistic language for being Jew and Gentile.
David Rudolph has written about that.
David Rudolph has
More.
written excellent things on that. I think that's my starting point. From my perspective, there's always been Israel and the nations. We have that throughout our Old Testaments. And what it means to be Israel is to live according to Torah and to follow God in a particular way. In the New Testament, you have this new category, which is not like Israel, who's worshiping the one true God, and the nations who are generally worshiping idols. You have the nations being accepted into covenant relationship with the God of Israel alongside the people of Israel, but not being called to live as Jews. That's how I read the book of Acts and the New Testament more broadly. I am always so curious what's behind these movements within Christianity or Messianic Gentiles to sort of take on Torah. Like, what's behind that? And very often what's behind that is kind of a wholesale rejection of church tradition because of some of the shadow side of church tradition that we've been talking about, right? So we've talked about the influence of Constantine. We haven't even gotten to later figures like Martin Luther, who also had this very dark anti-Semitic shadow side. And so I think you have Christians who are very disillusioned for good reason with Christianity, with things like Sunday worship, with things like Trinitarian theology in many cases. And so from my perspective, we can talk about the parting of the ways. And what I want to claim is that God has been leading and guiding each of these religious traditions and communities, even in their schism from one another, even in their blindness towards the way that they're intended to be related to one another. We can't just wholesale throw out Christianity, Christian tradition, in the same way that I would argue we can't wholesale throw out rabbinic Judaism. I think we need to sort of wrestle with both. And so I think in some sense, it's kind of exciting that you have all of these Gentiles who are excited to learn more about Judaism. On the other hand, it does oftentimes end up playing out in ways that I consider to be a bit unhealthy, that feels like sort of playing Judaism. Or
Unhealthy relationship.
And so I think it's a very complex question that the Messianic Jewish movement needs to be addressing in an intentional and a gentle way, because you have a lot of different motivations for those Gentiles who are drawn to Judaism. We really need to carefully parse out what's going on here. Who are these different groups of people? Why are they so drawn to Judaism? And how do we, according to our understanding of the scriptures, help to shepherd this phenomenon in a way that is faithful? It's a very large question. Absolutely.
Now, since our audience is mainly Christian, non-Jew kind of audience, could you address them somehow in a personal way and let them know why they should embrace Messianic Jews on a practical level? What can the non-Jewish wing of Christianity do to uphold, embrace, and support our Jewish brothers and sisters?
I think it's a really wonderful question. I spend most of my time teaching and speaking to Christians. And so I think we're living in this really exciting era where so much of, the things that we've been talking about, the parting of the ways, this kind of latent Christian anti-Judaism and later anti-Semitism is being called into question and rethought in our day. It's a really exciting time to begin to reframe key theological categories. I think it's a time that you have Christians kind of waking up to God's ongoing covenant with the people of Israel and sort of wrestling with the implications of the fact that, wait a second, like supersessionism is not the correct understanding of these categories. And I love helping Christians rethink key Christian categories. I do teaching and speaking on, like, what is the gospel? This gospel that we so often, especially in sort of Western evangelical Christianity, preach, is kind of missing some key realities that we see in the New Testament. And so I think I'm always encouraging Christians to just, like, don't be afraid to ask the hard questions. Like, there's these paradigms that have been passed on to us that were developed in a certain context whereby certain things were being assumed about Judaism, about Christianity, about Jews, about Christians. I think we're living in an exciting time where a lot of those categories are being rethought. And I think we're invited to be a part of that rethinking, reading our New Testaments where the Pharisees aren't always the bad guys, reading this narrative of Acts, and seeing that the apostles, the Jewish apostles, are shocked to see that the Spirit comes upon Gentiles as Gentiles, like, to sort of discover again this broader story that we see in the New Testament, whereby you have these Gentiles entering into covenant relationship with Israel's God
Right.
alongside the people of Israel. So again, I think there's a lot of directions that we could go with that. But I do think that Messianic Judaism represents, however we might criticize it because it's kind of messy, it has these different iterations. What we're trying to do is to follow Jesus authentically as Jews, which in the first century would have been the most natural thing to do. In our century, for all the reasons that we've talked about, not so much. And so I would encourage Christians to reach out, to learn about these things, to develop relationships with Messianic Jews if you can. And even to just develop relationships with Jews. I think there's been such a breakdown and so much dark, freighted history between Christians and Jews that even just kind of partnering with Jews, especially we haven't even talked about the state of Israel, but understanding what it might be like to be a Jew today. And for me, and we haven't talked much about my story, but I lived for a number of years just as a Christian. Like I sort of left my Jewish identity behind. And one of the most significant things for me was Christian friends who were aware of the Jewish calendar and would call me up and say, Shana Tova, happy Rosh Hashanah. Like, we know that this is when so just kind of cultivating an awareness of the Jewish calendar, what's going on in the Jewish world, because, the Jews need allies in this day and age, and Christians, historically speaking, have not always been those allies. And I think we're living in a time where there's a great opportunity for Christians to both learn more about Judaism and the Jewish people, learn about the Jewishness of the New Testament, the Jewishness of Jesus, the Jewishness of the gospel, and sort of begin to reimagine what might it look like to be participants in this very exciting and also very fraught time in which we're living.
Well, there you have it. We keep coming back to the whole subject of supersessionism and the implications that have taken us to the place we are even now. A wise rabbi, known as Abraham Heschel, once said in a famous lecture that Christians should understand that a world without Jews would be a world without the God of the Jews. And Christians and Jews worship the God of Israel. And we have to come to grips with this very deep theological question. I would love to have you on maybe sometime in the future. There's so many things that we couldn't talk about today, but at least I hope it's been clear what we wanted to explain about Messianic Judaism. Thank you for your time. Thank you for being with us. And shalom.
Shalom. Thank you for having me. It's really wonderful to discuss these things with you.
Thank you. We'll see us again soon. Bye.
We hope you've enjoyed today's episode. If you want to know more about King's Evangelical Divinity School, visit our website, kingsdivinity.org, or follow us on social media. We will be more than glad to have you study with us if you are interested in any of our courses. See you on our next podcast.